Um, our guest speaker this morning is Mr. Martin Cox. Mr. Cox is an economist, public speaker, teacher, and mentor. In his first career, he was an entrepreneur and company director, starting, building, and selling companies in transport, retail, education, and management consulting. His second career was in public affairs, where he was on the international board, the World Council of ICC. He was a CEO of ICC in Australia. While there, he wrote op-eds for the Australian Financial Review and 5 other national newspapers on trade policy, competition law, and government regulation. In 2005, Mr. Cox began a degree at the University of Oxford in philosophy, politics, and economics, PPE. After he graduated in 2008, he began working for the university as an economics tutor and as a member of the new International Growth Center, a joint venture between Oxford and LSE. He was subsequently appointed lecturer at Trinity College, Oxford. Now, he works full-time for the John Locke Institute, inspiring and equipping elite students. Please join me in warmly welcoming Mr. Martin Cox.
Remember, remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. So today's the 5th of November. In England, we commemorate this by pretending to set fire to a person. We're not as enlightened as you guys. Our civil discourse in England is a little bit barbaric. We've got a lot to learn from you guys because the way you do politics in this country is great. Yeah. And what we're commemorating on the 5th of November is the foiled plot to blow up Parliament by Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators in 1605. And back then, the Catholics hated the Protestants and the Protestants hated the Catholics, and they found every occasion to hurt each other. And today we are fighting in Britain not about Catholic versus Protestant, but about Remainers versus Brexiteers. You guys probably heard about that little scuffle we're having there. It seems to be going on and on in Britain. And it's not like, it doesn't really matter that much, I think, the Brexit versus the Remain faction. I mean, life's going to go on. It's not like some of those great contests of history that really matter, like Taft versus Hotchkiss, right? Yeah? You're going to show them on Saturday, right? Yeah? You're going to show them on Saturday? Yeah, good. I hope so. So, the way we do politics, I think, we have these big binary divides between Republicans and Democrats, between Tories and Labour, between Brexiters and Leavers, between people who are crazy about building a wall against Mexico and those who think that that's crazy. People who think that we're going to make life better by protecting workers by starting a trade war with China, and those who think that that's a bad idea. And very often the mistakes, as I see them in politics, that are made because people forget to distinguish between intentions and consequences. And so very often, political economy degenerates into people's wishful thinking. Who wouldn't want to protect the workers? American workers facing competition. If we can make the lives of the steel workers in Pennsylvania better, why wouldn't we do that? The arguments, though, are about whether it's going to work to bring in policies like, for instance, a trade war with China and putting big tariffs on all imported goods. That's a popular thing within factions of the Republican Party right now. This nationalism, which is manifested in the wall between the United States and Mexico and manifested in the trade negotiations and the trade punitive tariffs imposed against countries all over the world, but notably China. And it's interesting to me that something like 95% of economists think that trade barriers are a bad idea. But politicians love them. And politicians, I think, are guided in a democracy, as indeed they should be, I suppose. They're guided by what the population of voters wants. Unfortunately, the population of voters isn't very good at distinguishing between intentions and consequences. And so politicians are pandering to the voters in a way that gets those things muddled up. And so whereas an economist would make a careful distinction between a policy and its effects to distinguish between the intentions and the consequences, the politicians will champion policies that are popular and will get them voted into office and re-elected. So within the Republican Party, we've got some nationalism going on. Within the Democrat side of politics, if you like, we're also about protecting workers, but we're about protecting them from greedy bosses. Okay, and who wouldn't want to protect people from greedy exploitation? But the favorite means of doing that is by increasing the minimum wage. And increasing the minimum wage sounds like a great idea if you're thinking about people who are struggling on to make a living and earning very little, barely able to pay the rent, working all the hours they have, and still not making any progress. The problem is that if we take a social scientific approach and we look at the effects of minimum wage policy, we find that you can't just declare into existence something that you wish existed. Actually, the laws of economics apply even if you don't want them to. And so many economists, most economists, will say that raising the minimum wage is very dangerous because of disemployment effects. And it's very dangerous, most of all, for the people who have the most to lose by a policy that prices out of the market low productivity workers. So if you've got low skills, if you're a recent migrant, your English isn't very strong, then if the minimum wage is too high, it means that it's going to be very, very difficult for you to persuade a company to hire you. And so what comes out of a generous heart and a desire to make life better for the worst off people in America manifests itself in a policy that can make life worse for the most vulnerable. So there are two things that I disagree with. I usually don't have to look very far before I find people that I disagree with or who disagree with me. One thing on the right, one thing on the left. But one thing that brings everybody together is our detestation of sweatshops. I guess you know what I mean when I use the expression sweatshop. A sweatshop is a colloquial expression to describe a company in a poor country where the wages are very, very low, pennies per hour, and where the conditions are very, very bad. It's hot, the hours are long, the work is uncomfortable, the prospects for advancement are negligible or non-existent. And the people who labor day after day in these places are very unfortunate people. And so their employers, we want to do something about them. We want to stop that from happening. And there'll be movements that some of you are familiar with called ethical investment. We're not going to invest in companies that manufacture things in faraway places paying very low wages. Or ethical consumerism, where you're not going to buy shirts that are made by very poor people in faraway countries. And the problem with this, and I hope that there's a pattern emerging here, the problem with this is that our knee-jerk reaction, the obvious right thing to do, turns out not to be the right thing to do at all. So we might want to divest from investments in these areas. We might want to avoid buying things that are made in poor countries. We might want to persuade international organizations to ban sweatshops or impose a global minimum wage. The problem is, although that might arise from a generous, sympathetic intention, we need to stop and think about what the effects on the people who work in those places will be. And so, just to start the conversation with you and to get you thinking about this concept of unintended consequences, which I hope that you'll continue to think about. And I think for those of you who want to join me after this, we're having a session in the faculty room for people who want to challenge maybe some of the things I'm saying. But just to get you started in thinking about this, I want to suggest to you that what we need to do about the sweatshop problem is not to ban them or to boycott them. The answer to the problem is more sweatshops. We actually need to encourage more people to exploit low-wage workers. Now, you're looking at me, I'm wearing a suit and tie, and you're thinking, this guy is a typical capitalist. He's a typical heartless economist. But the thing is, if we care about the workers in sweatshops, we don't want to do what feels good to us. We want to do what is good for them. And what's good for a person who's desperate enough that they voluntarily choose to work in these conditions in such a place? What's good for them is for an increase in opportunities and an increase in wages. Now, in the very short time remaining to me, I want to suggest that there are two ways of raising the wages in sweatshops. One of them is for people to become more productive. So the sweatshop workers, if they became more valuable workers somehow, then they'll be worth paying more money to. That in itself is not going to solve the problem, but it's an important first step. Now, how can we make the sweatshop workers more productive? What can we do for them? A lot of people think education's the solution. But actually, if you're sewing things in a factory, it's not because you didn't turn up to calculus class that you're not productive or not as productive as you could be. And so, in fact, it turns out that one of the very best things you can do in order to become more productive in the labor force and in the workplace is to work, is to experience getting out of bed and going to work every morning. And so unemployment is the great enemy of productivity. I'm not talking about the productivity of a whole economy, although of course that is also true, but the productivity of an individual worker grows strongly and consistently when that person is actually working. And so unemployment is bad for many reasons in this country, but it's very, very bad for people who lack skills to make them generous contributors to the productivity of a company. And so the best thing we can do is provide employment opportunities in places where workers are unproductive. The second thing that will have an effect on wages is competition among employers. So it's one thing for workers to be more valuable, but of course if there's only one company that's employing those workers, that company will try to pay as little as the company can get away with. So merely having valuable workers, if those workers don't have alternatives, will just mean that the company is able to make a bigger profit, but it won't give it a reason to pay more wages. Now, if there's competition between employers, if there's not one sweatshop, but 2 or 5 or 100 sweatshops, and if the workers are being competed for by those firms, then those firms will compete the wage of the workers up. So we could try to ban sweatshops. We could abolish the employers that are giving these people in their wretched condition one more alternative, which is slightly better than the other alternatives they have. We could take away that slightly improved alternative. Or we could try to create the conditions that will reward such companies for coming in and, as I say, exploiting, quote unquote, the workers who live in those places. Because if we can encourage companies from around the world to go into low-wage economies and start businesses, then what will happen is that the wages of the people who live there will be competed up by the employers trying to get the best workers to work for them. So we can think of it this way. We can think about raising the floor below which no company would pay. Raising the ceiling above which no company would pay. So if the worker is only this productive, no firm wants to pay this much. So if we can make the productivity of the workers rise, then the firms are willing to pay more money. They'll never pay more than a worker contributes to the firm's output. This is not a kind of a human valuation of the worker. It's not saying this worker is worth less as a person. The worker's mother doesn't love her any less. But it's talking about whether the firm is willing to pay money in wages for a worker that's not making a strong contribution to the company. So if we can raise the productivity of the workers through experience in the workforce and avoiding the pitfalls of unemployment, that will raise the productivity. And then raising the floor, which is the minimum that people would be willing to accept as workers, that floor raises as we have more competition from employers. And so I won't have persuaded all of you here. It seems like a crazy idea. Sweatshops are a terrible thing, so let's try to get more of them. That sounds wrong. What I want to suggest to you is that in economics, very often we see a pattern, that what seems obvious turns out to be a bad idea. And what seems crazy and counterintuitive can often turn out to be a good idea. And I think that's true of the minimum wage. It seems like a good idea to raise the minimum wage. It turns out that it's bad for the least productive workers and causes unemployment. It seems like it would be a good idea to pass laws that are going to protect American workers from foreign competition. But it turns out that economists tend to agree that, in fact, free trade is better for prosperity of rich people and poor people in America and in other countries. So I'm going to leave you with that challenge to think about whether you can see beyond the emotion and if you can see beyond your instinct for making the world a better place. This is not a plea, by the way, for you to become complacent. I think at your age, many of you are ambitious to change the world and make it better. And I hope that you hang on to that ambition. But I want you to have not just soft hearts, but hard heads. And I want you to employ all the intelligence and all the advantages of the great education you're getting at this place to use that compassion in a way that actually makes life better for other people. Thank you.